Welcome to CivilNet. Today we're joined by Gerard Guerguerian, who is an advisor to the Human Rights Ombudsman of Nagorno-Karabakh, Gerard Stepanyan. On top of this, he is the executive director of a Francophone center in Stepanakert, as well as being an international lawyer, the executive director of several international companies in the US, France, and other countries. We'll be discussing today the issue of status of Nagorno-Karabakh, what is remedial succession, and prospects for the future. So, Gerard, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
To start off, when we speak about the Karabakh conflict, we hear the phrase, this issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh quite a bit. This is an issue that is unresolved, even after the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. What do we mean when we say the issue of status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and why is it unresolved?
To answer to the question, you have to go back a bit to the past history. The issue of Armenia in general and its borderlines is connected to the breakout of two empires, the Russian and the Turkish. So when it came out to decide what is Armenia, nobody knew where was the Armenia and where were the borders. So the Allies in 1918-19 at the Versailles conference, they have decided to elaborate a treaty called the Sèvres Treaty. And within that treaty, you have two articles which are their importance, 89, 92. 89, not knowing exactly what means Armenia, they have asked an arbitrator to decide about the borderlines of the western side of Armenia. But on the eastern side, they left it open in Article 92. That arbitration has nothing to do with the Treaty of Sèvres. Treaty of Sèvres is not valid, has never been ratified, but the judicial decision taken by President Wilson as an arbitrator has elaborated a border of Western Armenia, known as the Arbitration of Wilson. Now, the 92 Article 92, has left it open between the two countries to decide, Azerbaijan and Armenia, what would be the limits of their borderline. Having said that, it happened that the Allies lost their presence in the South Caucasus. Stalin came in, and he took a number of decisions, especially the Treaty of Moscow, giving Nakhichevan to the Turks, and dividing the Armenian territory in two pieces, creating the Oblast of Stepanakert and Nagorno-Karabakh. Which means that the question of what is the eastern side and eastern border of Armenia, including the eastern side of Nagorno-Karabakh, has never been technically resolved by a peace treaty. It's a decision taken by Stalin, the office of the Communist Party on July of 1920-21, I don't remember exactly the dates, but they have taken a decision which is a non-judicial legal decision. It was taken on the spot by the power in charge of the situation at that time on the territory. And then immediately afterwards, Nagorno-Karabakh has been annexed by the Azerbaijan power, regardless of the fact that the two states at a certain time, 6 months before that decision, have agreed on who was going to get Nagorno-Karabakh as a territory, and it was a decision already acted, even published by the two parties, that it would be Armenian side, but the Stalin decision has overturned that decision, and then you have Nagorno-Karabakh annexed. So when you say an annexation, that means you have not a legal basis for your claim, first. Second, you have an ambiguous situation about what could be the future of that territory. The only factual element is that Nagorno-Karabakh was an oblast. known as an oblast within the constitutional text of the Soviet Union for 70 years. It had a limitation of territory, it had its own population, and it had its own government. So the question of the status is at the heart of the conflict, whether that status has to remain, whether the status could continue to remain, or whether Azerbaijan is going to accept and agree to keep it as a status, or say this is incorporated in Azerbaijan.
And when we talk about resolving the issue of status, we hear the phrase remedial secession a lot. And some people argue that this is the best option. What is remedial secession? What do we mean by that? And do you think it is a good option?
Remedial secession does not exist under international law. It's a construction of the what we call the doctrine, that means the professors of law and people who are interested by the question of international law. Remedial decision, there is no decision as such today, but at the international court or by the governments speaking about remedial secession. The notion of remedial secession is, that means you cannot remedy to a situation unless you would agree that it could be seceded from the country governing or having a sovereignty on that territory. Because there is massacres, there is a genocide, there is a heavy burden on the population, and the only solution is to get rid of that situation by making a secession. Now, the question of secession, remedial secession, has four weaknesses. First, which is the most important, is how many people have to be killed in order to say that you need to elaborate a remedial secession. Are you going to kill 1 million, 1,000, or 100 in order to define the basis of a remedial secession? To what extent the volume of the massacre is going to push the countries or the international community to accept, to go towards a remedial secession? That's the first point. The second point, which has its own importance, is who is going to decide? Are the countries, both countries in conflict, who are going to decide that the best solution is remedial? Or is it the international community? Who in the international community? Which expert? What expertise? On what basis? The third element, which has also its own importance, is that once you have decided that it's remedial, you have to remedy, and by secession it's your tool. What sort of secession? Are you going to have an inclusive secession? That means you're still part of the country? Or is it going to be an ambiguous status? Or is it going to be an independence? Secession by such means a lot of things. So if you cannot have a clear-cut picture on the volume of the massacre, and the third party who is going to decide, that means you are not a decision maker. You are the victim of the genocide, you are the victim of the massacre, but you are not allowed to speak. Somebody else from you is going to say, dear sir, we're going to remedy for you because you're in a very bad shape, but we may decide not to remedy because you're in good shape. Who is going to make that decision on top of your head or behind your head? That is the big issue. For me, remedial secession is not a solution. It has been elaborated by the Anglo-Saxon reasoning of international law. It was not really applied for the Balkan conflict, the Kosovo conflict, and it doesn't make sense from an international law perspective to elaborate much more on it, because you would lose a lot of time and years, and conflicts will perdure and continue as such.
And Azerbaijan was unwilling to resolve the issue of status, to resolve the Karabakh conflict, when it was in a state of military defeat. Now it's in a state of military victory. Do you not think that it's even more unlikely now, in a sense, that the Karabakh conflict will be resolved?
Not really. There is an ambiguity in the notion of resolving the issue of Karabakh from the very beginning. It's the contradiction between territorial integrity and what is meant by territorial integrity, and what is meant by self-determination. Territorial integrity has nothing to do with the question of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. The integrity of Azerbaijan is not questioned by a state. People have to understand that there is no contradiction between the two terms. The International Court of The Hague, has made it very clear in the Kosovo case that those two notions, self-determination and territorial integrity, are not contradictory. They cannot contradict each other. If Armenia had a territorial claim against Azerbaijan, yes, the question of territorial integrity of Azerbaijan would be on the table. Now, Armenia is not claiming and has never claimed any territorial assets on Azerbaijan. So the issue of self-determination is within Azerbaijan by a population which has its own territory, claiming its own self-determination, asking to get rid of because there is no other solution, or trying to find a way to get an independence because they are not willing to live. Otherwise, if I make it very short, if the end subject of the conflict is war, that means Azerbaijan would have to kill all the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then the problem is resolved, or they push them out, or the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh is not willing to live with the Azeris, in which case they need to have a protection, and the only protection you can give to them is by giving them the self-determination right. Because once you have given the self-determination right, you are part of the international community. The international community has an obligation to protect you. So that's why the question of the status and the fact that the conflict has not yet ended is in the heart of the current situation.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the roles of some of the regional powers in the area, when we speak about the Karabakh conflict, Russia and Turkey oftentimes come up. And we saw in the 2020 war, both countries played a role in that conflict. So how do you see their roles? Do you think their roles are changing, and how does that relate to Nagorno-Karabakh, the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the future of Nagorno-Karabakh?
Russia and Turkey have, for sure, it's an evidence, a converging understanding and probably political alliance within the region. That is, for me, much more clear than before. It is specific to the region. It's not a worldwide alliance. It's not an alliance which might have an endless period, but it's a specific one. They have converging interests, both of them, whether in Syria, on the Kurdish question, or the Crimea question, or even the Caucasus question. It's putting them in a situation where they have to be in an alliance. And they are in an alliance. There is no question. For me, today, so far, there is no question that there is an alliance between Russia and the Turkish. Now, having said that, they are in a very ambiguous situation, the Russians, because they have to decide if they are going to get rid of the Christian European presence in the South Caucasus. That means by opening too much the door to a Turkish influence, they would have their own influence decreasing. That ambiguity with the alliance, which is in evidence today, is the unknown question of back and forth, going back and forth about their relationship. What is clear, however, is that they are, for the first time, the Russians, in their history, peacekeepers. They have never been peacekeepers before, as such, in the sense that two countries have accepted that an arbitrator would be a peacekeeper. That's why they have made a number of mistakes at the beginning. They have a role which is not yet defined, clearly defined in the agreement of November 9. But they are peacekeepers. And that peacekeeping position is something very important for Russia, because it's a premiere. They have never done it. Internationally, they are in the Minsk Group, and they're playing their role as a Minsk Group player by being a peacekeeper. So they will not give up easily that role. That potential position they have compared to the Azerbaijan position to get rid of the Armenian question or to get rid of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, open the corridor on this unique, is creating the tension you're seeing today.
And you mentioned the relationship between Russia and Turkey, but what about Russia and Azerbaijan? Lately, some people are saying that there's some contradictions coming out of Moscow and Baku. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev was lamenting that Armenia now is wanting to increase the number of arms it buys from Russia, and on top of this, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, made some statements which seemingly were contradicting what was coming out of Baku. I'm wondering what you make of this. Do you think that there's a shift going on, or how can we explain what's going on in terms of the relationship between Baku and Moscow?
It's included in the contradiction of the agreement of the Treaty of November 9 and the so-called agreement of January 11. There is an ambiguity which is very clear. Are we speaking about the corridor on the Syunik? That means an out of sovereignty of Armenia, a road which is not within the sovereignty of Armenia? Or are we speaking about opening the communication roads and railroads? It's clear that for Azerbaijan, they want to make the link. They want to make a sovereignty link between Azerbaijan and Turkey. They are claiming to have one army, that's what I heard at least, or at least a portion of the army within the same commanding system. They are very close in terms of strategic alliance with Turkey, so they want to resolve the issue of the corridor. I don't think, and I'm sure it is not the case, that what was meant by the Russians, at least in their understanding of what is the opening of that borderline, was a corridor. Corridor, you have 2 or 3 corridors in history, the important ones. You have the Danzig corridor, which was crossing Poland in 2 pieces. You have the German corridor from west to Berlin from the western side. Corridor is something which you don't touch if you are a sovereign country. The fact that there is a claim for a corridor means a lot for the Iranians. That means their borderline is not anymore the Turkmenchai Treaty, which would be a huge revolution. For the Russians, the same. It would be a comeback historically. For the Armenians, certainly a cut of Syunik. That means a lot. So how it's going to evolve in the future, I think currently everybody is negotiating. Everybody is putting on the table the elements of negotiation, and the negotiation is getting harder and harder. And everybody is pushing its own elements in advance. The declarations of Aliyev are very strong. The Russian declaration was not an easy one. It was even very strong. The French one, the US is much more quiet for the moment, but the Europeans have taken a very clear position. So you have the elements of the tension of negotiation, whereby the people are not yet sitting around the table. Whether they're going to sit around the table or there will be a war, that's an uncertain question.
And in terms of the future, I mean, the November 9th agreement stipulates that the Russian peacekeeping mission is for a minimum of 5 years. So, I mean, 1 year, it is coming up to 1 year since the war started. But in 4 years' time, how do you see the situation progressing? And do you think that the Russians are here to stay? Or do you think that in 4 years we could see a different situation?
Nobody has said, and it's not written, it's a minimum of 5 years. What is said in the agreement is that after 5 years there would be a decision. So it means that each party is free to decide differently at the end of the 5 years. That's the first important point. Second point, the question of the contradiction between what the Azeris want, what the Armenians could have, and what the Russians would be winning is connected to the question of the status. Let me go back 5 seconds. The November 9 agreement is by 90%, 80% connected to what the Minsk Group have been saying for 10 years. For more than 10 years, whether it was the conference of Astana, Muskoka, whatever, they were constantly saying the same, meaning you give up the territories, you open a corridor, you don't decide immediately about a self-determination, but you're protected by peacekeepers, and the status of the Nagorno-Karabakh would have to be decided in a pacific way. Now, the November 9 agreement is exactly the same. If you take it from the perspective of a Russian thinking, they have an agreement of which they are part of the Minsk Group, which they are implementing. That means they have opened the corridor, 5 kilometers. Nobody was defining the 5 kilometers, but now it's defined in the document. The occupied territories have been given back. That's what the Minsk Group has been saying since 10 years. You have to give back 5 plus 2. The only remaining portion not called occupied was the oblast of Nagorno-Karabakh. Today you have the Nagorno-Karabakh, except the only difference is Shushi. So if you resolve the question of Shushi, you are within the frame of the Minsk Group. The only difference is that Shushi has been lost compared to what the Minsk Group was saying constantly since 10 years. So the Russians are in their role. They're not out of their international role within the Minsk Group. They are applying what the Minsk Group was saying since 10 years. So they will be the deciding power because they have the support of the US and the French. The Western countries or community is not going to say no, or is not going to have a negative approach on what the Russians are doing because they are in the role of the Minsk Group.
Yeah, well, we speak about the Minsk Group. I mean, the Armenian officials say oftentimes that any settlement should be under the auspices of the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs. But the November 9th agreement, in a sense, you say that this was things that the OSCE Minsk Group was working on for 10 years, but was kind of left out of the agreement as an entity. So I'm wondering, after this war, how do you see the role of the OSCE Minsk Group?
The agreement of November 9 has implemented factually what the Minsk Group was saying since 10 years. The November 9 is a treaty by itself, which is not a peace treaty yet, but it is a treaty. And the arbitrator of that document is a member of the Minsk Group. So if you take it from that perspective, you have one of the players of the Minsk Group, whether under delegation or not without a delegation, but with a implementation of the Minsk Group ideas, which is being implemented by the Russian forces, full stop. So the question of the November 9 being out or not has nothing to do with the international community is within the Minsk Group ideas. Now, if you go to resolve the issue by weapons, you don't need the Minsk Group. The Minsk Group is only a diplomatic institution to resolve politically a problem or a conflict, which means that if you are battling or conflicting, or you have a war perspective, the Minsk Group has no importance at all and cannot have an importance. The Minsk Group has been delegated by the United Nations to the OSCE. The OSCE has created the Minsk Group in order to find a pacific solution to the conflict of Karabakh. That means it's a diplomatic institution. It's not a war perspective institution. So if you are in a war perspective, the Minsk Group doesn't exist. But if you are within those 5 years where people are going to try, without using any weapons, to resolve the issue of the conflict of Karabakh, then you need a diplomatic institution, and the only one is the Minsk Group. So whether the Turks would say yes or no, it doesn't matter. As long as you are within the diplomatic perspective, the only institution to take care about the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh is the Minsk Group, because it represents the United Nations decision within the delegation given to the OSCE, which is the institution made for the pacific solution of conflicts, and that's the only way to resolve a pacifically the question.
And I also want to get your take on the other members of the OSCE Minsk Group. I mean, France's president, Emmanuel Macron, has made statements which many perceive as friendly towards Armenia, and the French ambassador to Armenia, Jonathan Lecotte, made some interesting statements. He even was speaking about the possibility of military cooperation, but then mentioned that Armenia and France are part of different alliances. America is a bit bogged down with what's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, but how do you see the roles of the two other members of the OSCE Minsk Group?
The French are very proactive. For Armenia, they're going probably a bit far from what they could have imagined to do before the conflict. They have taken a very strong position, at least at the level of the president and not of the diplomacy. There is a nuance between the foreign affairs of France and the president, but the president has been very clear to give a very clear-cut definition of who was the aggressor. Second, they are willing to help much more the Armenians. They have been pushing strongly the Europeans to put on the table sufficient financing for Armenia. The French ambassador, as you said, was speaking about military cooperation. At the end of the day, between France and Armenia, the links are very strong. For the conflict, however, the conflict as such, they cannot go beyond their role of the Minsk Group. So they are within the cultural and humanitarian perspective. They are allowing the opening of the French Francophonie Center in Stepanakert. They're not doing it directly. There is no direct link, for sure. But they're not objecting to it, or they're not stopping it. Culturally, they want to promote Western culture within the Armenian regions, including Nagorno-Karabakh. They're willing to go further, but within the limitation of their role, humanitarian and cultural, for the Nagorno-Karabakh. The US have not yet taken a clear position. The only position which is the current one is the Minsk Group position, with the nuance opened by the former representative of the US within the Minsk Group, who has been speaking about a corridor more or less large. Now, more or less large now is meant by 5 kilometers, which means a good portion, good bunch of territory, which creates an opening to Karabakh. That's the only nuance. The rest is very unclear. However, there is one point which has to be taken into account in the reasoning. The Turkish alliance with Azerbaijan is the Silk Road connection with China. That has its importance. Now, many others are speaking about the South-North Stream. That those two roads are contradicting themselves on the region. The Europeans have taken very clear position on that question. They are putting 2.6 billion euros on the table. That's a lot of money for infrastructure only, not something else. Well, whoever speaks about infrastructure means railroads, roads, etc. That means they're speaking about a road, like the Silk Road. So that's where we are today.
And you are the executive director of the Maison Paul Éluard. This is the Francophonie Center in Stepanakert. Can you tell us a bit about it, how this was set up, and what benefits this will bring to Artsakh?
Artsakh is left alone. More you bring something new to Artsakh, better it is. They are left alone. They are in a very bad shape. They are far away from everything. They even today are much more separated from Armenia, technically, factually, even if the road is open, but that you feel it, that there is a mental separation. They have been seriously injured during the war. They have lost their territories. They are not proud as before. So whatever brings in of whatever sort of nuance, people, structure, building is a plus for Artsakh, that's for sure. And they are looking at the Francophonie Center as a sort of a respiration, that something is happening. And actually the first decision I have taken after the war was, are we going to continue? The answer was yes. If we would have said maybe we have to wait, the same impression would not have been given. The fact that we said yes, we're going to continue and it's going to be done was a sort of a strong respiration for the population. And they're looking at it as an important center because it's a big center. Now, the core of the decision was taken some years ago. The Francophonie Center has always existed through French lessons, but they didn't have their building. So they came and see me to take it over as a project. I said, finally, yes, after 2 years of back and forth, I put my conditions. I told them that it has to be this a certain way. Once they have accepted, I took over the project. The project is on a 3,000 square meters, 1,000 constructed, 2 parts. One is a restaurant, cafe, lounge, French way with a bakery to give the French flavor, to give the French impression, to give the French aspect. But at the same time to create the financing of the center, which is the second part of the Francophonie Center, in order not to live only with subsidies. So the rent, the cafe rents the portion of the building, gives the money to the center so that the salaries of the center are paid. So that's a sort of a system which permits to continue to survive for years instead of asking always subsidies from governments, etc. The second part is 3 restrooms, 3 rooms for like an hotel for people coming in, 3 classrooms, important ones, a mediathèque, and downstairs now in the basement there is an IT school. The idea is to form, coach specialists, send them to France for a while, but before sending them to France, give them the possibility to understand French, so they learn French, and then they go for a stage internship in France. So the doctors, I have, for example, 2 doctors today, they're learning French. I have given my green light because they are speaking French correctly. They're going to France in the next 3 months, for 2 months, to get a specialty from there, to get acquainted to the new technologies, etc., and then come back and work at in Artsakh. I have the same for the bakery person. The bakery person is going to go in January in a French bakery. She's going to learn how to make croissant, viennoiserie, chocolate croissant, etc. And then she's going to come back and operate in Artsakh. Same for the touristic girls. They're learning French. They're going on. My manager, my deputy manager, will be coming to France to learn French. and have a stage of management in France and then come back. So the idea is to form some specialists within the year, 4 or 5 projects. They learn French first, and then they go into France. The rooms to stay is when the French specialists come over. Instead of going to the hotel and be disconnected from the population, which is an easy way to live in Artsakh. I mean, you go to the hotel, you spend your night, and then the second day you give your lesson. I want to put them within the center and live in the center so that they eat with the people, they eat with the students, and they live with the students, so that there should be some connection, interaction between the students and the specialists who would come to Artsakh. The IT school has been funded. It's open already, and it's going to form specialists on visual arts and development coding. So that's a project.
Well, Mr. Guerguerian, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.